The sun rises over the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, casting long, amber shadows across a facade of limestone, so vast it seems to defy the very gravity of the hillside it rests upon. This is Biltmore, a monument to the staggering wealth of the Vanderbilt dynasty, and a structural testament to the American Gilded Age. Hundreds of miles to the north, nestled on the highest point of Long Island's Gold Coast, another titan of stone stands in silent competition. Oheka Castle, the French-inspired chateau of financier Otto Hermann Kahn, rises from the earth with a different kind of grace, reflecting the manicured elegance of a socialite's dream. These two estates represent the pinnacle of private residential construction in the United States, yet their stories are not merely about architecture and art. They are parallel chronicles of ambition, the fragility of fortune, and the radical ways in which two families attempted to immortalize themselves in a rapidly changing world. To understand the magnitude of these palaces, one must first look at the men who dared to build them. George Washington Vanderbilt II was the grandson of the Commodore, the man who built the New York Central Railroad and amassed a fortune that made the family the wealthiest in the world. George, however, was not like his brothers or his father. He was a scholar, a quiet man who preferred the company of books and rare manuscripts to the cutthroat boardrooms of Manhattan. He sought a retreat, a place where he could create a self-sustaining world of agriculture, forestry, and high culture. He found his sanctuary in Asheville, where he began acquiring over 125,000 acres of land. This was not a hobby, it was an empire. Meanwhile, Otto Kahn arrived in America from Germany with a brilliance for finance and a soul for the arts. As a partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, he became one of the most influential bankers in history, reorganizing railroads and stabilizing the American economy. But Kahn wanted more than just a seat at the table of power. He wanted to be the bridge between the world of money and the world of beauty. When his previous country home burned down, he decided to build something that could never be destroyed. Between 1914 and 1919, he constructed Oheka, an acronym of his own name, on an artificial hill in Cold Spring Harbor. While Biltmore was born of old money inheritance and a desire for isolation, Oheka was born of new money brilliance and a desire for social integration. The scale of these two undertakings is almost impossible to process by modern standards. Biltmore remains the largest privately owned home in the United States, spanning over 4 acres of floor space within its walls. It features 250 rooms, including 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces. When construction began in 1889, it required the creation of its own brick kiln, a woodworking factory, and a 3-mile railroad spur just to transport materials to the site. Over 1,000 workers labored for 6 years to realize Vanderbilt's vision. The result was a masterpiece of the French Renaissance style, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect who designed the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. Oheka Castle, while smaller than Biltmore, was no less ambitious in its engineering. Kahn, haunted by the fire that took his previous home, insisted that Oheka be entirely fireproof. It was constructed of steel and concrete, then clad in limestone, making it one of the first truly fireproof private residences in the country. It boasted 127 rooms and over 100,000 square feet of space. It was the second largest private residence in America at the time, surpassed only by Biltmore itself. The gardens at Oheka, designed by the Olmsted brothers, were inspired by the formal grandeur of Versailles, featuring reflecting pools and geometric hedges that seemed to stretch into the Atlantic Ocean. These two homes were more than just shelters, they were stages. At Biltmore, Vanderbilt hosted the elite of the world, offering them a lifestyle that rivaled European royalty, complete with a massive library of over 20,000 volumes and an indoor swimming pool that was a marvel of Victorian engineering. At Oheka, Kahn became the ultimate host of the Jazz Age, throwing parties that defined the era and reportedly serving as the inspiration for J. Gatsby's estate in F. Scott Fitzgerald's legendary novel. But the Gilded Age was a bubble, and even the thickest stone walls could not fully protect these palaces from the shifts in American society. The introduction of the federal income tax in 1913, followed by the devastating impact of the Great Depression and the rising costs of labor, began to erode the foundations of these massive estates. As we look at these two structures today, we see two very different outcomes. Biltmore remains in the hands of George Vanderbilt's descendants, a thriving private enterprise that has transitioned from a family home to a premier tourist destination, maintaining its original splendor through a meticulously managed business model. Oheka, however, faced a much darker path. After Kahn's death, the estate passed through several owners, serving as a retreat for New York City sanitation workers and later a military academy, before falling into a state of heartbreaking ruin. It became a playground for vandals, its windows smashed and its grand halls filled with debris, nearly facing the wrecking ball before a heroic restoration effort saved it from total erasure. This is the story of how two men built the impossible, and how their legacies were forced to adapt to a world that no longer had room for kings. We will explore the architectural rivalries, the hidden rooms, the scandals that echoed through these corridors, and the sheer willpower required to keep these monuments standing. From the massive banquet hall of Biltmore to the sunken French gardens of Oheka, we are stepping back into a time when wealth was expressed not in digital numbers, but in millions of tons of hand-carved stone. The contrast between Vanderbilt's quiet, sprawling forest and Kahn's glittering, socialite fortress provides a unique lens into the American soul. It is a story of survival, of the transition from private extravagance to public treasure, and the enduring fascination we have with a period of history where the only limit to a man's home was the reach of his imagination. As we peel back the layers of these two estates, we find that the stone walls hold more than just memories. They hold the blueprints for the American dream in all its glory and its excess. The journey through these palaces begins with the land itself, and the radical transformations required to turn the wilderness of North Carolina and the coast of Long Island into the grandest estates the world has ever seen. The sheer logistical audacity required to bring Biltmore and Oheka Castle into existence is something that modern construction projects, even with our advanced robotics and digital modeling, struggle to emulate. To truly understand part 2 of this saga, we must look at the literal foundations and the architectural DNA that George Vanderbilt and Otto Kahn demanded for their estates. George Vanderbilt did not just want a large house. He wanted a self-sustaining French Renaissance chateau dropped into the rugged, untamed wilderness of the southern Appalachians. He had traveled extensively through Europe, particularly the Loire Valley, and became enamored with the architectural flourishes of the 16th century. He specifically looked toward the Chateau de Blois and the Chateau de Chambord, with their spiraling stone staircases, ornate dormers, and steeply pitched roofs. To bring this vision to life, he hired Richard Morris Hunt, the undisputed dean of American architecture at the time. Hunt's challenge was monumental. The site Vanderbilt chose was beautiful but isolated, lacking any of the infrastructure needed to support a construction project of this magnitude. This led to the creation of a massive private railroad, which hauled millions of pounds of limestone from Indiana directly to the construction site. It is estimated that the exterior of Biltmore contains over 11 million bricks, all of which were fired in a kiln built specifically for the project on the estate grounds. The stone carvers, many of whom were brought over from Europe, spent years suspended on scaffolding, hand-chiseling the intricate gargoyles and floral motifs that adorn the facade. This was a symphony of manual labor and industrial might. While the exterior looked like a relic of the old world, the interior was a marvel of the new world. Vanderbilt insisted on the latest technology, which meant Hunt had to integrate complex plumbing, electricity, and one of the earliest fire alarm systems into a structure that looked 500 years old. The heating system alone was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering, utilizing 3 massive boilers and a network of pipes that spanned the entire basement level. While Vanderbilt was carving a mountain to fit his home, Otto Kahn was quite literally building a mountain on the flat plains of Long Island. When Kahn decided to build Oheka, he wanted the highest point on the island to ensure he had a commanding view of the surrounding landscape and the distant waters of the Cold Spring Harbor. Since the natural topography didn't provide this, he hired a small army of laborers to haul thousands of tons of earth to create a massive artificial hill. This man-made plateau became the base for his fireproof fortress. Unlike Vanderbilt, who leaned heavily into the Renaissance, Kahn and his architects, Delano and Aldrich, looked toward the more restrained and symmetrical elegance of the French chateau style, but with a distinctly early 20th century focus on structural integrity. After the total loss of his previous wood-framed mansion, Kahn was obsessed with the idea of permanence. Oheka was built as a monolithic structure of reinforced concrete, a relatively new and bold choice for a luxury residence. The walls were then finished with a thick layer of limestone-colored stucco to give it the appearance of a classic stone castle. This gave Oheka a unique aesthetic that was both ancient and modern. It lacked the heavy, brooding Gothic influences found in parts of Biltmore, opting instead for clean lines, expansive terraces, and a sense of airy lightness. The construction of Oheka also saw the involvement of the Olmsted brothers, the sons of Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who had designed Central Park and, ironically, was simultaneously working for Vanderbilt at Biltmore. This creates a fascinating link between the two projects. The same landscape philosophy was being applied to both, yet adapted for vastly different climates and social goals. At Biltmore, the elder Olmsted was focused on reforestation and creating a productive landscape that felt like a wild, natural forest. At Oheka, the sons were creating a highly controlled, formal environment where every hedge and water feature was a statement of man's dominance over nature. The amount of labor required for Oheka was equally staggering, with hundreds of craftsmen working to install the intricate wrought iron railings, the hand-painted murals, and the expansive marble floors. It is also important to note the financial climate of these two construction periods. Vanderbilt began his work during the height of the Gilded Age, before any concept of income tax, when the Vanderbilt family was essentially a sovereign power. Kahn, however, began his construction as the world was descending into the chaos of World War. This meant Oheka faced shortages of materials and labor, yet Kahn pushed forward with a relentless pace, often paying premium prices to ensure his vision was not compromised by the global conflict. The two estates also differed in their relationship to the local community. Biltmore was so large it created its own village, Biltmore Village, to house the workers and provide services for the estate. It was a feudal system adapted for the American South. Oheka, on the other hand, was part of the Gold Coast social circuit, a string of massive estates owned by the Morgans, the Whitneys, and the Walworths. While Biltmore was an island of wealth in a sea of rural poverty, Oheka was a jewel in a crown of similar, though smaller, mansions. This distinction would later play a massive role in how the two properties survived the 20th century. As the structures rose, they became the talk of the international press. Biltmore was hailed as the American Versailles, a title that Vanderbilt reportedly disliked as he viewed it more as a working farm than a royal palace. Kahn, conversely, embraced the theatricality of Oheka. He wanted it to be a place where the greatest opera singers, actors, and world leaders would feel at home. This led to the design of the grand ballroom and the various dining halls that were specifically engineered for acoustics and flow, ensuring that every party was a sensory masterpiece. The sheer scale of these two projects also meant that they were never truly finished. Even after the families moved in, teams of gardeners, engineers, and domestic staff worked around the clock to maintain the illusion of perfection. At Biltmore, this meant maintaining thousands of acres of forest and miles of private roads. At Oheka, It meant keeping the reflecting pools crystal clear and the lawns like green velvet. The cost of maintenance alone for these homes was enough to bankroll a small city, a fact that would eventually become the Achilles heel for both families. As we look deeper into the architecture, we see that Biltmore's complexity lies in its verticality and its sprawling wings that follow the ridge of the mountain. It is a house of layers, from the dark, cavernous kitchens and laundry rooms in the basement to the airy, sun-drenched bedrooms on the upper floors. Oheka's complexity is found in its horizontal symmetry and its connection to the gardens. The house and the landscape were designed as a single unit, where the indoors and outdoors blurred together through massive arched windows and grand staircases that led directly into the fountains. Both men were using architecture to write their names into history, but they were using different ink. Vanderbilt was writing a story of legacy, land, and lineage. Kahn was writing a story of success, culture, and the ultimate celebration of the self-made man. These two palaces stood as the final, grandest gasps of an era where a single individual could command the resources of a nation to build a private home. The limestone was set, the concrete was poured, and for a few brief decades, it seemed as though these monuments would stand forever as symbols of an unstoppable American ascendancy. But even as the finishing touches were being put on the gold leaf ceilings and the marble mantels were being polished, the world outside was beginning to change in ways that neither Vanderbilt nor Kahn could have fully anticipated. The age of the great estates was about to collide with the age of the modern world, and the survival of Biltmore and Oheka would soon depend on more than just the strength of their stone walls. While the stone and mortar of Biltmore and Oheka Castle provide the physical skeleton of this story, it was the breath of daily life within their walls that truly defined the Gilded Age experience. Stepping inside these palaces was not merely entering a home. It was entering a highly calibrated machine designed to produce an atmosphere of effortless perfection. At Biltmore, George Vanderbilt's daily existence was governed by a quiet, intellectual rigor that stood in stark contrast to the boisterous social climbing of his New York relatives. A typical morning for George began in his private suite, where his valet would have already prepared his attire and managed the intricate details of his grooming. Vanderbilt was a man of routine, often spending his early hours in the massive library, a room that many consider the heart of the house. With its hand-painted ceiling by Giovanni Pellegrini and a collection of books that eventually swelled to over 23,000 volumes, the library was where George felt most at home. He was a polyglot, capable of reading in 8 different languages, and he treated his collection not as a display of wealth, but as a working laboratory for his mind. Meanwhile, the unseen army of staff, numbering between 30 and 40 for the house alone, was already deep into a choreographed ballet of service. The domestic staff at Biltmore lived in a world of strictly defined hierarchies. In the basement, the kitchens were a hive of activity, overseen by a chef who had to manage the logistics of feeding not just the family, but the dozens of guests and the staff itself. The distance from the kitchen to the formal dining room was so great that keeping food hot was a constant engineering challenge, requiring the use of specialized warming cabinets and a dumbwaiter system that was state-of-the-art for the 1890s. For a guest at Biltmore, the experience was one of total immersion. Upon arrival at the private train station, they would be whisked away through miles of landscaped forest, eventually emerging from the trees to see the castle looming ahead. Their days were filled with horseback riding through the thousands of acres of managed timberland, hunting, or playing croquet on the massive lawn. Evenings were formal affairs, where the 3-story-high banquet hall became the stage for multi-course meals served under a ceiling that seemed to touch the clouds. The acoustics were such that a whisper at one end of the long table could be heard clearly, a design choice that facilitated both intimate gossip and grand pronouncements. Hundreds of miles away at Oheka Castle, Otto Kahn was running a different kind of theater. If Biltmore was a scholarly retreat, Oheka was the ultimate salon of the 20th century. Kahn was a man of boundless energy and a deep passion for the performing arts, serving as the chairman of the Metropolitan Opera. His home was designed to be a hub for the cultural elite. On any given weekend, the guest list at Oheka might include world-renowned tenors, Hollywood starlets, European royalty, and the titans of Wall Street. Unlike the more reserved Vanderbilt, Kahn was the quintessential host who delighted in the spectacle. The staff at Oheka had to be prepared for anything, as Kahn's parties were legendary for their scale and creative flair. It was not uncommon for the sunken gardens to be transformed into a literal stage for private performances. The logistics of maintaining Oheka were equally demanding. The estate had its own power plant, a massive greenhouse system to ensure fresh flowers were in every room regardless of the season, and a private golf course that was considered one of the finest in the country. Kahn's daily life was a whirlwind of financial deals conducted from his opulent study, followed by long afternoons on the terrace discussing art and philosophy with his guests. The sheer volume of service required to keep Oheka running meant that the staff lived in a dedicated wing, their lives completely separate from the opulence they maintained. The kitchens at Oheka were designed for high-volume catering, capable of producing banquets for hundreds of people at a moment's notice. This constant state of readiness was the hallmark of the Kahn household. However, both estates shared a common thread, the immense pressure of maintaining the illusion. Behind the silk wallpaper and the marble statues were the realities of plumbing failures, the constant struggle against dust in such massive spaces, and the social anxiety of staying relevant in an increasingly competitive upper class. At Biltmore, George Vanderbilt's marriage to Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898 brought a new sense of purpose to the house. Edith took an active role in the estate's management, particularly in the Biltmore industries and the agricultural side of the property. She understood that for Biltmore to survive, it couldn't just be a drain on the family fortune. It had to contribute. This led to the expansion of the dairy farm and the forestry programs, creating a sense of a working community that felt more like an English manor than an American mansion. At Oheka, Addie Kahn played a similar, though perhaps more socially focused, role. She managed the complex social calendar and ensured that Oheka remained the premier destination on Long Island. Yet, for all the laughter in the grand ballroom and the scholarly quiet of the library, both families were beginning to feel the weight of their creations. The financial cost of living on this scale was astronomical. At Biltmore, the taxes and the upkeep of over 100,000 acres were starting to outpace even a Vanderbilt's income. George began to sell off parcels of land to the federal government, land that would eventually form the core of the Pisgah National Forest. This was the first crack in the dream of a private empire. At Oheka, the costs were similarly daunting, but Kahn's wealth seemed more flexible, tied to the soaring markets of the 1920s. But money was only part of the equation. The cultural shift following World War I meant that the very idea of a 100-room private home was beginning to look antiquated, even garish, to a younger generation. The staff became harder to find as better-paying industrial jobs opened up, and the rigid social structures of the Gilded Age began to dissolve. Within the walls of these two palaces, the clocks were still ticking, but the world they were timing was moving toward an inevitable conclusion. We see the parallel lives of the workers as well, the gardeners who spent their entire careers trimming the hedges at Oheka, and the foresters who lived in the remote corners of the Biltmore Estate. For them, these palaces were not symbols of excess, but sources of stability and pride. The relationship between the masters of the house and those who served them was a complex web of paternalism and professional duty. As we move forward in our journey, we will see how these internal dynamics, the cost of the staff, the changing social tastes, and the looming economic clouds, set the stage for the dramatic survival of one estate and the tragic fall of the other. The dinner parties would eventually end, the libraries would grow quiet, and the families would have to decide if these monuments to their past were worth the price of their future. For now, however, the lights are still on, the champagne is still flowing at Oheka, and the fires are still burning in the 65 fireplaces of Biltmore. It was the golden hour of the American palace, a time when it seemed that as long as the stone stood firm, the life within would never fade. But as any architect will tell you, the foundation is only as strong as the ground beneath it, and the ground of the American economy was about to shift in a way that would change everything forever. The transition from the Roaring Twenties to the bleak reality of the 1930s acted as a seismic shift that tested the structural and financial integrity of every great American estate. But for Biltmore and Oheka Castle, the impact of the Great Depression was felt in profoundly different ways. At Biltmore, the crisis did not begin with the stock market crash of 1929, but rather with the untimely death of George Vanderbilt in 1914. George had passed away following complications from an appendectomy at the age of only 51, leaving his widow Edith and their daughter Cornelia to navigate the massive financial burden of the estate. By the time the Depression hit, the family had already been forced to make difficult choices, including the sale of nearly 87,000 acres to the United States Forest Service to create the Pisgah National Forest. This move was both a sacrifice and a savvy survival tactic, as it relieved the family of a massive tax burden while ensuring the land George loved would be preserved. However, as the American economy collapsed in the early 30s, the income from the Vanderbilt Trust funds plummeted, and the cost of maintaining a 250-room mansion became a mathematical impossibility for a private family. In an act of desperation and foresight, the city of Asheville approached Edith Vanderbilt with a proposal. The local economy was suffering, and the city leaders believed that opening the doors of Biltmore to the public could stimulate tourism and bring much-needed revenue to the region. In March of 1930, in the darkest days of the Depression, Biltmore officially opened its doors to paying visitors for the first time. It was a radical move. At the time, the idea of a family living in one wing while strangers toured their dining room was almost unheard of in the upper echelons of society. Yet it was this early pivot to a commercial model that saved Biltmore from the wrecking ball. The public was hungry for a glimpse of the Gilded Age fantasy as an escape from their own hardships, and the admission fees, though modest, began to provide a lifeline for the estate's staff and upkeep. While Biltmore was finding a new purpose through public access, Oheka Castle was entering a period of quiet, somber decline. Otto Kahn had survived the initial crash of 1929 better than many of his peers, but the prolonged economic stagnation of the 30s eventually took its toll on his health and his optimism. Kahn, the man who had been the lifeblood of the New York art scene and the host of the most glittering parties on Long Island, found himself withdrawing from the public eye. The once bustling halls of Oheka grew silent. The cost of maintaining a staff of over 100 employees and the massive expenses of the formal gardens became a heavy weight. When Otto Kahn passed away in 1934, he left behind a world that was unrecognizable from the one in which he had built his castle. His widow, Addie, attempted to maintain the estate for several years, but the era of the Gold Coast was over. The high property taxes, combined with the lack of a sustainable business model like the one being pioneered at Biltmore, meant that Oheka was becoming a liability rather than an asset. By 1939, the Kahn family made the difficult decision to sell the estate. However, in an economy still reeling from the Depression, there were no buyers looking for a 100-room private home. This marked the beginning of Oheka's identity crisis. Unlike Biltmore, which remained anchored by the Vanderbilt family's presence and their connection to the local community, Oheka was sold to the Welfare Honor Relief Association of the New York City Sanitation Department. The grand halls that once hosted opera stars and presidents were converted into a retreat and vacation home for sanitation workers and their families. While this was a noble use of the space, the delicate architectural details and the refined atmosphere of Kahn's dream began to suffer under the weight of high-traffic institutional use. The contrast during this decade is striking. Biltmore was learning to be a business, treating its history as a commodity that could preserve its future. The Vanderbilt family was leaning into the role of stewards, actively working with the local population to ensure the estate's survival as a regional landmark. At Oheka, the connection between the creator and the structure had been severed. Once the Kahn family left, the castle lost its soul and became merely a set of very expensive walls. The labor required to maintain the formal gardens was slashed, and the geometric precision of the Olmsted design began to blur as nature reclaimed the edges. This period also saw a shift in how the American public viewed wealth. The populist anger of the 30s made the blatant excess of the Gilded Age palaces a target for criticism. Yet Biltmore managed to bypass much of this resentment by positioning itself as a provider of jobs and a patron of the arts and local agriculture. Oheka, hidden behind the gates of Long Island and stripped of its social functions, became a relic of a bypassed age. The physical toll of the Depression on these buildings was subtle but cumulative. At Biltmore, repairs were prioritized based on what would keep the tour route safe and impressive, while the more remote areas of the house began to show their age. At Oheka, the institutional owners lacked the specialized knowledge or the budget to maintain the fireproof concrete and the complex plumbing systems that Kahn had so carefully engineered. Both estates were holding their breath, waiting to see if they would survive the most challenging economic decade in American history. As the world moved toward the brink of World War II, the fates of these two palaces were diverging sharply. One was becoming a public monument, while the other was beginning a long, slow descent into obscurity and decay. The sheer resilience of Vanderbilt's vision, bolstered by Edith's pragmatic leadership, stood in contrast to the fragmented legacy of Otto Kahn's family, who found themselves unable to sustain the gargantuan demands of Oheka. This era proved that stone and steel were not enough to guarantee immortality. A palace needed a purpose that extended beyond the ego of its builder. Biltmore found that purpose in the eyes of the public, while Oheka was left to wonder what it would become in a world that no longer valued the private ballroom. The lessons of the 1930s would set the stage for the next 40 years, where one estate would rise to become a national icon, and the other would nearly vanish from the map entirely. The dream of the Gilded Age was being dismantled, brick by brick and tax bill by tax bill, leaving only the most adaptable structures to weather the coming storm of the mid-20th century. As the world plunged into the chaos of the 1940s, the massive footprints of Biltmore and Oheka Castle were viewed through a new, utilitarian lens by a nation at war. No longer were these structures merely symbols of a bygone era of excess. They became strategic assets. At Biltmore, the quiet of the Blue Ridge Mountains offered a unique security that the coastal cities lacked. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States government became increasingly concerned about the safety of the nation's artistic treasures stored in Washington, D.C., fearing that the National Gallery of Art might be a target for enemy bombers. In a secret arrangement between the Vanderbilt family and the federal government, Biltmore's music room, which was largely unfinished at the time, was transformed into a high-security vault. For several years, dozens of the world's most priceless paintings and sculptures, including works by Rembrandt and Raphael, were crated and stored within the thick limestone walls of the North Carolina estate. Armed guards patrolled the corridors where socialites once danced, and the Vanderbilt family lived alongside these silent, hidden masterpieces. This period solidified Biltmore's reputation not just as a mansion, but as a fortress of American heritage. The family's willingness to serve the national interest during the war further endeared the estate to the public, creating a sense of shared history that would be vital for its post-war survival. While Biltmore was serving as a secret sanctuary for art, Oheka Castle was undergoing a much more visible and rigorous transformation. After the New York City sanitation workers' retreat concluded, the United States Merchant Marine moved in, using the sprawling grounds and the massive interior spaces as a training facility. The transition from a luxury estate to a military academy was jarring. The formal gardens, once the height of refined European landscaping, were now used for drills and maneuvers. The marble floors were subjected to the heavy tread of service boots, and the grand rooms were partitioned into dormitories and classrooms. By 1948, the estate was sold again, this time to the Eastern Military Academy. For the next 30 years, the identity of Oheka would be tied to the shouts of cadets and the rigid structure of military life. While this prevented the house from being immediately demolished, it was a period of slow structural erosion. The maintenance required for a house of that scale was simply not part of the school's budget. Elaborate wood carvings were painted over with institutional beige, and the intricate plumbing and heating systems, once the marvel of Otto Kahn's engineering, began to fail and were patched with makeshift solutions. The divergence between the two estates during the mid-20th century was becoming a chasm. Biltmore, under the guidance of George Vanderbilt's grandson, William Cecil, began to lean even more heavily into its role as a self-sustaining enterprise. Cecil realized that if Biltmore was to survive as a private home, it had to become a world-class destination. He began a decades-long process of professionalizing the tourism aspect of the estate, investing in the restoration of original furnishings, and expanding the agricultural operations to include what would eventually become a highly successful winery. Biltmore was being curated. Oheka was being consumed. The military academy's tenure at Oheka was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the school kept the roof intact, and the walls standing during an era when many other Gold Coast mansions were being leveled to make way for suburban housing developments. On the other hand, the soul of Otto Kahn's French chateau was being buried under layers of institutional neglect. The reflecting pools were drained and filled with earth or left to become stagnant ponds, and the geometric hedges of the Olmsted design grew wild and unrecognizable. By the time the Eastern Military Academy went bankrupt in the late 1970s, Oheka Castle was a shadow of its former self. It stood empty, a giant of concrete and limestone abandoned to the elements and the whims of vandals. This period marks the lowest point in the history of either estate. While Biltmore was celebrating its centennial and welcoming hundreds of thousands of guests, Oheka was being systematically stripped of its dignity. Scavengers broke into the abandoned halls, ripping out copper piping, smashing the remaining stained glass, and even starting fires on the marble floors to keep warm. The fireproof construction that Kahn had insisted upon was the only thing that kept the building from burning to the ground during this era of lawlessness. The contrast in ownership was the deciding factor. The Vanderbilt family's unbroken line of stewardship provided Biltmore with a long-term vision and an emotional anchor. Oheka, having been passed from one institutional owner to another, had no one to advocate for its history or its beauty. It was viewed as a white elephant, a burden too large to maintain and too expensive to fix. The fate of these two palaces illustrates a hard truth about the Gilded Age. The buildings themselves could not survive on stone alone. They required a living purpose and a dedicated protector. As the 1980s approached, Biltmore was a crown jewel of American tourism, proving that a Gilded Age palace could be modernized and made profitable. Oheka Castle, conversely, was a rotting shell, its gardens overgrown by a literal forest, its windows staring like empty eyes over a landscape that had forgotten its name. It seemed almost certain that Oheka would follow the path of so many other great mansions and disappear into the footnotes of history. But the story of survival is often unpredictable, and just as Biltmore had been saved by a bold pivot to the public, Oheka was about to meet a man who saw something in its ruins that no one else could. The post-war era had tested both houses, one through the pressures of success, and the other through the trials of abandonment, setting the stage for a dramatic rescue that would eventually bring Otto Kahn's dream back from the brink of total annihilation. The battle for these houses was not just against the elements, but against the passage of time and the shifting values of a country that was rapidly moving away from its aristocratic flirtations toward a more modern, streamlined identity. Yet the enduring pull of these grand spaces remained, a testament to the fact that even in a world of glass and steel, the human spirit still craves the majesty of the palace. The 1980s marked a definitive crossroads for both estates, as the gap between Biltmore's polished success and Oheka Castle's tragic decay reached its absolute peak before a dramatic reversal of fortune began. At Biltmore, the decade was defined by the visionary leadership of William Amherst Vanderbilt II, who had taken the reins of the estate with a singular goal: to make the property entirely self-sufficient without the need for outside subsidies or family trusts. Cecil was a pioneer in what we now call heritage tourism, and he understood that the house needed to be more than a museum. It had to be an experience. During this time, the Biltmore Company invested heavily in the estate's infrastructure, expanding the visitor center and refining the tour experience to include more of the behind-the-scenes areas that had previously been hidden from the public eye. The most significant development was the official opening of the Biltmore Estate winery in 1985. By converting the old dairy barn into a state-of-the-art production facility and tasting room, the family was able to leverage the agricultural roots of the property to create a luxury brand that extended far beyond the house itself. Biltmore was no longer just a destination for history buffs. It was becoming a lifestyle brand associated with fine wine, southern hospitality, and horticultural excellence. The sheer volume of visitors allowed the company to fund massive restoration projects, such as the meticulous cleaning of the exterior limestone and the preservation of rare tapestries that had hung in the halls since George Vanderbilt's day. Biltmore was the gold standard of how a Gilded Age palace could thrive in a modern economy, acting as the largest employer in the region and a cornerstone of the North Carolina tourism industry. Meanwhile, on Long Island, Oheka Castle was entering its final hour. After the military academy departed, the house sat abandoned for several years, and it had become a skeleton of its former self. The roof was leaking, the magnificent plaster ceilings were collapsing under the weight of water damage, and the gardens had been replaced by a dense forest of invasive trees and vines that clawed at the limestone walls. It was during this period of absolute darkness in 1984 that a developer named Gary Melius entered the scene. Melius was not a traditional preservationist. He was a self-made man with a background in construction and a penchant for big risks. When he purchased Oheka Castle, many in the community thought he was a fool. The building was a wreck, and the cost of bringing it back to life was estimated in the tens of millions of dollars. However, Melius saw through the graffiti and the rubble to the bones of the fireproof concrete structure Otto Kahn had built. He began what remains the largest private residential restoration project in American history. The work was grueling and often felt impossible. Because the estate had been so thoroughly stripped by vandals, Melius and his team had to rely on archival photographs and original blueprints from the Delano and Aldrich archives to reconstruct the details. Thousands of window panes had to be replaced, and the massive slate roof, which had been a sieve for decades, required a total overhaul. One of the most symbolic moments of the restoration was the clearing of the gardens. It took months of heavy machinery and manual labor just to reveal the original footprint of the Olmsted design. As the earth was moved, the stone edges of the reflecting pools began to emerge like ancient ruins being rediscovered. Melius's approach was different from the Vanderbilt model. While Biltmore focused on preserving a family legacy, Melius was essentially reviving a dead monument and turning it into a commercial venue for weddings, film shoots, and luxury lodging. He realized that for Oheka to survive, it had to become a place where people could not only visit but participate in the fantasy of the Gilded Age. This led to the creation of the Oheka Castle Hotel, which offered guests the chance to sleep in the very rooms where Otto Kahn once hosted the world's elite. The restoration of Oheka was a high-stakes gamble that relied on the growing interest in the Great Gatsby era and the allure of the Gold Coast. While Biltmore was refining its status as a national treasure, Oheka was clawing its way back from the grave. The two projects illustrate the two different ways history is saved in America. At Biltmore, It was a steady, generational stewardship that never allowed the fire to go out. At Oheka, it was a sudden, miraculous resurrection fueled by a single individual's obsession. The 1980s also saw a cultural shift where the public began to view these houses not as symbols of inequality, but as rare examples of craftsmanship that could never be replicated. The loss of so many other mansions during the suburban boom of the mid-20th century had created a scarcity that made Biltmore and Oheka even more precious. As the restoration of Oheka's facade neared completion, it began to attract the attention of Hollywood, becoming a favored filming location for movies and television shows that needed an atmosphere of unattainable wealth. This media exposure provided Oheka with a new kind of social currency, mirroring the way Otto Kahn had used the house to influence the culture of his own time. Biltmore, too, became a cinematic icon, appearing in major films that showcased its Gothic grandeur to an even wider global audience. By the end of the decade, the fates of the two houses were finally beginning to align once more. Both were now functioning as professional enterprises, using their own history as the engine for their survival. The Vanderbilt family had successfully navigated the transition from private owners to corporate stewards, and Gary Melius had successfully transitioned from a developer to a guardian of history. The battle against decay was being won on both fronts, but the challenges were far from over. As the world moved toward the turn of the millennium, these two palaces would have to face the pressures of modern environmental standards, the rising costs of specialized labor, and the need to keep their stories relevant to a new generation of visitors who had no living memory of the Gilded Age. The stone was secure, the gardens were blooming, and the halls were once again filled with light, but the true test of their longevity would be whether they could maintain their soul while serving as commercial enterprises. The parallel paths of Biltmore and Oheka serve as a powerful reminder that even the most grand of structures are fragile, and that their survival is never an accident, but always the result of a deliberate, and often very expensive, choice to remember. Entering the 21st century, the management of Biltmore and Oheka Castle transitioned from a struggle for basic survival into a high-stakes masterclass in historic preservation and brand evolution. The sheer physical reality of maintaining these structures in the modern era is a task that borders on the Sisyphean. At Biltmore, the Vanderbilt legacy is now managed by a sophisticated corporate entity that oversees not just a house, but an entire ecosystem of commerce, conservation, and hospitality. The complexity of the maintenance at Biltmore is staggering. For example, the limestone exterior, which was hand-carved over a century ago, is constantly battling the humid, variable climate of the North Carolina mountains. Modern preservationists at the estate utilize a mix of traditional masonry techniques and cutting-edge technology, such as laser scanning and drone inspections, to monitor the stability of the hundreds of gargoyles and decorative carvings that sit high above the ground. Every single one of the 250 rooms requires a specialized climate control strategy to protect the priceless tapestries, original furniture, and rare books from the ravages of moisture and temperature fluctuations. The Biltmore Company has even pioneered sustainable practices, installing a massive solar tree farm to help offset the enormous energy demands of the estate. This move toward green energy is a fascinating echo of George Vanderbilt's original vision of a self-sustaining forest and farm. Today, the estate is a sprawling operation that includes the primary house, multiple luxury hotels, the most visited winery in the United States, and an extensive retail and dining division. This commercial success is what funds the never-ending cycle of restoration. For instance, the recent multi-year project to restore the massive glass roof over the Winter Garden was a feat of engineering that required custom-made materials to match the 19th century aesthetic while meeting 21st century safety codes. At Oheka Castle, the challenges of the new millennium have been equally intense, though they are often framed by the estate's role as a premier high-end venue. After Gary Melius successfully brought the building back from the brink of collapse, the focus shifted to the painstaking detail of historical accuracy. The restoration of the formal sunken gardens alone involved the replanting of thousands of boxwoods and the restoration of the complex fountain systems that had been dry for decades. Unlike Biltmore, which benefits from the vast acreage of the Blue Ridge Mountains, Oheka is an island of Gilded Age grandeur surrounded by the suburban sprawl of Long Island. This makes the visual integrity of the estate even more precious. To maintain the illusion of a secluded French chateau, the management of Oheka must carefully curate every sightline. The business model at Oheka is heavily dependent on the luxury events industry, particularly high-profile weddings and corporate retreats. This creates a unique set of stresses on the building. While Biltmore manages thousands of tourists a day on a structured path, Oheka must accommodate hundreds of guests moving through the grand ballrooms and terraces for high-energy celebrations. This requires constant vigilance over the marble floors and the ornate plasterwork. The logistics of running a boutique hotel inside a concrete fortress built in 1919 mean that every modern convenience, from high-speed internet to advanced catering kitchens, must be hidden behind the historic fabric of the walls. Both estates have also had to navigate the complexities of their public images in a more socially conscious era. There is a delicate balance between celebrating the craftsmanship and beauty of the Gilded Age, while also acknowledging the staggering wealth inequality that made such structures possible. Biltmore has leaned into its history as a center for agricultural innovation and forestry, highlighting the estate's role in the birth of American conservation. Oheka has leaned into its status as a cultural icon, frequently hosting events that celebrate the arts and the history of the Gold Coast. The digital age has also changed the way these palaces are experienced. Social media has turned every corner of Biltmore and Oheka into a potential viral moment, driving a new kind of visual tourism that demands the grounds be kept in a perpetual state of photogenic perfection. This pressure for aesthetic flawlessness means that the gardening crews at both estates are now as vital as the masons. At Biltmore, the gardens designed by Frederick Law Olmsted are managed by a team that balances historical accuracy with modern botanical science, ensuring that the blooms are timed perfectly for the seasonal festivals that draw in the crowds. At Oheka, the geometric precision of the hedges must be maintained with surgical accuracy to preserve the formal French aesthetic that defines the property's brand. The cost of labor remains the greatest hurdle for both properties. Finding craftsmen who still understand how to work with ancient limestone, leaded glass, or hand-tufted textiles is increasingly difficult and expensive. Both Biltmore and Oheka have essentially become patrons of dying arts, employing some of the last specialists in their respective fields. As we look at the daily operations of these two giants, we see that they are no longer just houses. They are living, breathing entities that require constant nourishment in the form of capital, labor, and public interest. The survival of Biltmore was ensured by a family that refused to let go, while the survival of Oheka was ensured by a man who refused to let it stay dead. Both paths led to the same destination, a world where these palaces are more than just relics of the past. They are active participants in the modern economy. The resilience of the stone is matched only by the resilience of the business models that support them. As we move further into the 21st century, the question is no longer whether these houses can stand, but how they will continue to evolve as the world around them changes. The story of Biltmore and Oheka is a story of adaptability, proving that while the Gilded Age may be over, its monuments can still command our attention, our respect, and our wonder, provided there is someone willing to pay the price of their keep. The legacy of George Vanderbilt and Otto Kahn lives on, not in the quiet halls of a museum, but in the bustling energy of two of the most remarkable commercial enterprises in America. The architectural majesty of Biltmore and Oheka Castle is often measured by their soaring ceilings and expansive facades, But much of the true character of these palaces lies hidden behind the silk wallpaper, and within the thick limestone walls where secret passages and hidden rooms reside. These features were not merely the whims of eccentric billionaires. They were essential components of the social and functional machinery of the Gilded Age. At Biltmore, George Vanderbilt and architect Richard Morris Hunt designed the house with a complex network of concealed doors and corridors that allowed the massive staff to move through the home unseen by the guests. This was the era of the invisible servant, where the illusion of effortless luxury was maintained by a workforce that seemed to appear and disappear by magic. One of the most famous of these hidden features is found in the library, where a secret door disguised as a bookshelf leads to a spiral staircase. This allowed Vanderbilt to access his private quarters or the guest suites without ever having to traverse the formal public halls. Another fascinating mystery is the billiard room, where a concealed door behind a wooden panel leads to a hidden smoking room and a series of service tunnels. These passages were not just for staff. They provided a sense of privacy and intimacy in a house that was otherwise overwhelmingly public. The sheer thickness of Biltmore's walls, sometimes reaching several feet of solid masonry, allowed for these voids to exist without compromising the structural integrity of the home. Even the massive banquet hall contained secrets, including a hidden organ loft and a series of acoustic chambers designed to project music perfectly into the space while keeping the musicians out of sight. These architectural riddles reflect George Vanderbilt's personality, a man who valued intellectual solitude and private study, even while living in the largest house in America. Across the coast at Oheka Castle, Otto Kahn's approach to secret spaces was driven by a different set of priorities, blending the practical need for fireproofing with a playful sense of jazz-age theatricality. Because Oheka was built with reinforced concrete, the creation of hidden voids was more of a challenge than it was at the stone-built Biltmore. Yet Kahn and his architects managed to integrate several remarkable features. One of the most legendary stories involves the secret passages that supposedly led from the main house to various points on the grounds, designed to allow high-profile guests to arrive or depart without being spotted by the paparazzi of the day. There is also the mystery of the hidden wine cellar, which was essential during the era of Prohibition. Kahn was known to be a gracious host who did not let the restrictive laws of the time dampen his legendary parties, and Oheka was rumored to have multiple concealed storage areas for his extensive collection of spirits. The library at Oheka, much like the one at Biltmore, features clever cabinetry and hidden niches that housed Kahn's most private documents and rare manuscripts. Perhaps the most intriguing architectural mystery of Oheka is the way the house was engineered to handle its massive weight on a man-made hill. The basement levels are a labyrinth of concrete pillars and reinforced vaults that feel more like a modern bunker than a Gilded Age mansion. These lower levels contained not only the mechanical heart of the house, but also tunnels that facilitated the movement of goods and coal, ensuring that the heavy lifting of estate life never disturbed the serene elegance of the upper floors. The use of secret doors at Oheka also served a social function. In an era where reputations were everything, having a way to move between guest wings without passing through the main foyer was a highly valued feature for Kahn's elite visitors. These hidden elements also speak to the security concerns of the era. Both Vanderbilt and Kahn were among the wealthiest men in the world, and kidnapping or theft was a very real threat. The ability to lock down certain sections of the house or move family members through internal passages provided a layer of physical security that the exterior gates could not. As we peel back the layers of these two estates, we find that the secrets are not just physical spaces, but also technological ones. Biltmore featured a complex system of electric bells and speaking tubes that functioned as a Victorian version of an internal network, allowing the master of the house to communicate with the kitchen or the stables instantly. At Oheka, the fireproofing itself was a secret weapon against the most common destroyer of the great mansions. The concrete walls were so thick that they acted as natural soundproofing, creating a sense of total silence and isolation even during a massive gala. The exploration of these hidden rooms also reveals the human side of life in the palaces. In the small, unadorned spaces behind the grand rooms, we find the marks of the workers, the graffiti of a plumber from 1893, or a discarded newspaper from the 1920s found under a floorboard during restoration. These traces of the common man, hidden within the walls of the elite, provide a grounding contrast to the gold leaf and marble. Today, as visitors tour Biltmore or attend weddings at Oheka, the knowledge that there is more to the building than meets the eye adds a layer of intrigue and mystery to the experience. The secret doors remain a favorite highlight of any tour, sparking the imagination of how life was truly lived when the public wasn't watching. These architectural mysteries remind us that Biltmore and Oheka were not just static monuments. They were living organisms with internal lives that were often quite different from the image they projected to the world. The master's hidden staircase and the banker's secret cellar are the physical manifestations of the dual lives led by the men who built these palaces, lives of immense public power and deeply guarded private passions. As we move forward, we will see how these architectural choices influence the long-term survival of the buildings, as the very features that once provided privacy for the elite now provide fascinating narratives for the modern public. The stones of Biltmore and the concrete of Oheka have many stories yet to tell, and some of the most compelling ones are still locked behind panels that only a few know how to open. The legacy of the Gilded Age is written in the grand ballrooms, but its secrets are kept in the shadows, waiting for the next generation to rediscover the hidden world of George Vanderbilt and Otto Kahn. While the architectural brilliance of Biltmore and Oheka Castle often dominates the conversation, the true magnitude of these estates can only be grasped by looking beyond the stone walls to the radical transformations of the earth itself. George Vanderbilt and Otto Kahn did not just build houses, they engineered entire ecosystems, bending nature to their aesthetic and philosophical wills. At Biltmore, the landscape was perhaps the most ambitious component of the entire project. When Vanderbilt first surveyed the land in Asheville, he did not find the lush, rolling forests we see today. Instead, he found a landscape that had been ravaged by over-farming and intensive logging. The soil was depleted and the hillsides were scarred. To fix this, Vanderbilt turned to Frederick Law Olmsted, the father of American landscape architecture. Olmsted's vision for Biltmore was revolutionary. He convinced Vanderbilt that the vast majority of the 125,000 acres should be turned into a managed forest, effectively creating the first school of forestry in the United States. This was not merely about planting trees, it was about the birth of American conservation. Olmsted designed the approach road, a 3-mile deliberate journey from the estate entrance to the house, designed to immerse the visitor in a carefully curated experience of nature. He used native plants to create a sense of mystery, where the house remains hidden until the very last moment, emerging like a crown jewel from a sea of green. The formal gardens closer to the house, including the Italian garden and the rose garden, were designed to provide a transition from the rigid geometry of the architecture to the wilder, naturalistic forest beyond. This required the movement of millions of cubic yards of earth and the installation of complex drainage systems that still function today. The legacy of this work is the Pisgah National Forest, a gift to the American public that began as a private billionaire's backyard. In contrast, the landscape of Oheka Castle was a triumph of man's dominance over a flat and unremarkable coastal terrain. Otto Kahn wanted a French formal garden that would rival the great estates of Europe, but he lacked the natural topography to achieve the dramatic vistas he craved. His solution was an engineering marvel. He ordered the creation of a massive artificial hill, a plateau that raised the house above the surrounding Long Island landscape. To surround this elevated fortress, the Olmsted brothers, the sons of Vanderbilt's architect, designed a sunken garden that utilized the principles of forced perspective and geometric precision. The Oheka Gardens were a masterclass in the use of water as a structural element. 8 reflecting pools were arranged in a symmetrical pattern, creating a mirror for the castle's facade and the shifting sky. Unlike the wild, forest-focused approach at Biltmore, Oheka's landscape was about control, prestige, and the social function of the outdoors. The terraces were designed for large-scale entertaining, where guests could wander through parterres of clipped boxwood and rows of London plane trees that felt like an extension of the ballroom. However, maintaining these 2 different versions of paradise required vastly different strategies as the decades passed. At Biltmore, the challenge was one of scale and biological management. The family had to learn how to balance the needs of a working farm and a massive timber operation with the aesthetic requirements of a tourist destination. This led to the creation of the Biltmore Nursery and a sophisticated horticultural department that preserved rare species and maintained the historical integrity of Olmsted's plan. At Oheka, the challenge was survival against the elements and neglect. During the years of abandonment, the formal gardens were almost entirely swallowed by the earth. When the restoration began in the 1980s, the team found that the reflecting pools had been filled with tons of debris and soil. The process of uncovering the gardens was akin to an archaeological dig. They had to rediscover the original stone foundations of the fountains and use old photographs to determine the exact species of trees that Kahn had favored. Today, both landscapes face the modern pressures of climate change and environmental sustainability. Biltmore has integrated modern conservation techniques, using the estate as a living laboratory for sustainable forestry and water management, staying true to Vanderbilt's original intent. Oheka, meanwhile, has become a sanctuary of classical garden design in an area of Long Island that has otherwise been heavily developed. The contrast between the two is a reflection of the 2 men who commissioned them. Vanderbilt the conservationist, who looked toward the longevity of the land, and Kahn the aesthete, who looked toward the immediate impact of beauty and order. The landscape of Biltmore teaches us about the resilience of nature when guided by a steady hand, while the landscape of Oheka teaches us about the fragility of man-made beauty and the immense effort required to keep it from returning to the wild. Both estates demonstrate that a palace is only as grand as the world it inhabits, and that the true measure of a Gilded Age legacy is not just the height of its towers, but the health of its soil and the clarity of its water. As we walk through the azalea gardens of North Carolina or stand by the reflecting pools of Long Island, we are seeing the results of a century-long conversation between human ambition and the natural world. This intersection of horticulture and history is what gives these properties their soul, ensuring that even if the houses were empty, the land would still tell the story of the men who dared to reshape the American earth. The pursuit of rare and beautiful objects was the defining spiritual exercise of the Gilded Age, and for George Vanderbilt and Otto Kahn, their homes were essentially the world's most expensive frames for their sprawling art and antique collections. At Biltmore, the interior was not decorated in the modern sense. It was curated over years of international travel, with Vanderbilt personally selecting every tapestry, painting, and piece of furniture to reflect a specific historical narrative. Walking through the halls of Biltmore today is like taking a master class in European art history from the perspective of a 19th century connoisseur. The walls are adorned with massive 17th century Flemish tapestries that depict the story of Venus and Mars, pieces so rare and fragile that their preservation today requires a dedicated team of textile specialists who work in a climate-controlled laboratory on the estate. Vanderbilt also had a keen eye for portraits, commissioning some of the greatest artists of his day to immortalize his family and friends. The most striking of these is the portrait of George himself by John Singer Sargent, which captures the quiet, thoughtful nature of the man who built the Mountain Palace. The house also contains works by James Abbott McNeill Whistler and Pierre-Auguste Renoir, showcasing a surprisingly modern taste for a man so invested in the architecture of the past. Beyond the fine arts, Biltmore is a treasure trove of decorative arts, including a chess set that once belonged to Napoleon Bonaparte and a gaming table used by the French emperor during his exile on St. Helena. These objects were not just trophies. They were links to a global history that Vanderbilt felt he was continuing. The sheer volume of the collection is almost impossible to grasp, with thousands of individual items listed in the original inventory, ranging from rare Ming Dynasty porcelain to the leather-bound volumes that line the library walls. Protecting these treasures during the transition from a private home to a public museum was a monumental task, especially given the environmental challenges of the North Carolina climate. The Biltmore Company has spent decades painstakingly cataloging and restoring these items, ensuring that the rooms look exactly as they did when the Vanderbilts hosted their first Christmas in 1895. At Oheka Castle, the art collection reflected Otto Kahn's deep and personal connection to the performing arts and the vibrancy of the early 20th century. Kahn was a man of the theater, and his home was filled with pieces that celebrated drama, music, and the visual spectacle of the stage. He was a significant patron of the arts, often buying works not just for their investment value, but to support the artists he believed in. The grand ballroom at Oheka was designed as a showcase for his collection of European masterpieces, and the walls were once lined with works that spanned from the Italian Renaissance to the French Impressionists. However, the fate of the Oheka collection offers a tragic contrast to the preservation at Biltmore. When the Kahn family was forced to sell the estate and the era of the Great Gold Coast parties came to an end, much of the collection was dispersed. During the decades of institutional use and eventual abandonment, the interior treasures of Oheka were largely lost to auctions, theft, and the elements. When Gary Melius began the restoration in the 80s, he was faced with an empty shell. To recreate the atmosphere of Kahn's era, the restoration team had to source period-appropriate antiques and commission replicas of original fixtures based on grainy black and white photographs. This process of historical recreation is a different kind of preservation, one that focuses on the spirit of the space rather than the original physical objects. Today, Oheka is filled with grandeur once again, but it is a curated grandeur that pays homage to Kahn's taste rather than housing his actual possessions. The contrast between these two approaches, Biltmore's original, unbroken collection versus Oheka's reconstructed aesthetic, highlights the different legacies of the two families. Vanderbilt's wealth was anchored in land and a physical inheritance that remained intact, while Kahn's wealth was more fluid, tied to the shifting markets and the ephemeral world of the arts. This difference is also visible in the way the two houses handle their archives. Biltmore maintains a massive collection of original letters, blueprints, and domestic records that provide a granular look at the daily lives of the family and the staff. Oheka's history has to be pieced together from public records and social columns, making the house feel more like a legend than a documented reality. For a modern visitor, the experience of the art at Biltmore is one of authenticity and weight. You are standing in front of the same painting that George Vanderbilt looked at while drinking his morning coffee. At Oheka, the experience is more about the theatricality of the space, a realization of the dream of the Gilded Age that feels as much like a movie set as it does a historic home. Both houses, however, serve as vital reminders of a time when the American elite viewed themselves as the heirs to European culture, using their vast fortunes to bring the best of the old world to the new. The preservation of these interiors is a constant battle against light, dust, and time. At Biltmore, every curtain and carpet is monitored for fading, and the specialized cleaning of the carved wood and stone is a year-round occupation for the conservation staff. At Oheka, the challenge is maintaining the high-traffic luxury of a working hotel while protecting the plasterwork and the recreations that make the building so unique. These two palaces are not just structures. They are massive, complex museums that require a sophisticated understanding of chemistry, history, and art to keep them from fading into the gray of the past. As we move closer to the end of our journey, we can see that the true value of Biltmore and Oheka lies not just in their size, but in the stories told by the objects they contain, the stories of the artists who created them, the men who bought them, and the generations of people who have worked to ensure they are never forgotten. The gold leaf may be thin, but the history it covers is deep and enduring, a golden thread that connects the modern world to the glittering ambition of the Gilded Age. Behind the towering limestone walls and the meticulously manicured hedges of Biltmore and Oheka Castle, life was not always a series of seamless garden parties and intellectual triumphs. The Gilded Age was as much defined by its staggering pressures and private heartbreaks as it was by its public opulence. To understand the full weight of these palaces, one must look at the human cost of maintaining such a monumental existence, and the scandals that occasionally pierced the veil of their perfection. At Biltmore, the most profound tragedy was perhaps the isolation that often accompanied George Vanderbilt's immense wealth. Despite his vast resources, George was a man of quiet temperament who often struggled to fit the boisterous mold of the Vanderbilt dynasty. His marriage to Edith Stuyvesant Dresser was by all accounts a happy and grounded partnership, yet the pressure of birth and the management of a failing agricultural empire weighed heavily on him. When he died suddenly in 1914 at the age of 51, the estate was left in a precarious financial state that nearly crippled his young widow. The scandal of the time was not one of infidelity or crime, but of inheritance and the brutal reality of the new federal income tax. The Vanderbilt fortune, once thought to be inexhaustible, was being liquidated at an alarming rate just to keep the lights on in Asheville. His daughter Cornelia, who grew up in the shadow of the Great Castle, eventually became the center of a more traditional social scandal when she decided to walk away from the gilded life entirely. After marrying the British diplomat John Cecil and bearing 2 sons, Cornelia grew restless with the rigid expectations of the American aristocracy. In the 1930s, she famously left Biltmore, changed her hair, moved to Europe, and lived a much more bohemian life. Eventually divorcing Cecil and distancing herself from the estate that her father had intended to be her eternal legacy. This departure was a shocking blow to the family image, forcing the management of the estate onto her husband and eventually her children, who had to reconcile their mother's abandonment of the house with their own duty to preserve it. Across the miles at Oheka Castle, the scandals and tragedies were colored by the high-octane energy of the Jazz Age and the intense scrutiny of the New York social scene. Otto Kahn was a man of immense charm and public influence, but his position as a Jewish immigrant who had climbed to the very top of the American financial ladder made him a target for both admiration and deep-seated prejudice. Despite his generosity as a patron of the arts, he was often excluded from the very top tier of the old-money social clubs, a snub that partially fueled his desire to build a house so grand it could not be ignored. However, the darker side of life at Oheka often involved the sheer exhaustion of the social treadmill. The pressure to host the world's elite took a toll on the Kahn family's privacy and health. There were whispers of the intense strain Kahn faced while balancing his role at the Metropolitan Opera with the volatile nature of Wall Street. The most significant tragedy for the Oheka legacy, however, was the rapid decline of the family's influence following Otto's death. Unlike the Vanderbilts, who had a multi-generational strategy for their land, the Kahn family found themselves adrift in an era that was increasingly hostile to the Great Gatsby lifestyle. The sale of Oheka was seen by many as the final gasp of an era of decadence that had lost its moral and financial compass. The period when the castle served as a military academy brought its own set of grim stories, as the once elegant rooms were witness to the rigid, sometimes harsh discipline of mid-century military schooling, far removed from the artistic salon Kahn had envisioned. The abandonment of Oheka in the late 70s and early 80s created a vacuum that was filled by more modern darkness. The house became a magnet for occult rumors and local legends, with stories of hauntings and illegal activities taking place within its rotting walls. For years, the local community saw the castle as a scar on the landscape, a reminder of a failed dream. Even the restoration by Gary Melius was not without its modern-day dramas, as the financial risks involved in saving a 100-room concrete fortress led to high-stakes legal and political battles that often played out in the local press. The personal toll on those who try to own these houses is a recurring theme in both stories. To own Biltmore or Oheka is not just to possess a piece of real estate, it is to be possessed by the building itself. The constant need for revenue, the never-ending repairs, and the weight of historical expectation can become a burden that overshadows the joy of living in a palace. We see this in the letters of the Vanderbilt family, who often spoke of the house as a white elephant that required their total devotion. At Oheka, the transition from a private home to a commercial hotel was born out of the necessity to avoid the tragedy of a second abandonment. This shift meant that the private sanctuary Otto Kahn built for his family is now a place where strangers celebrate their own milestones, a trade-off that is common in the survival of the great estates. The darker side of these palaces also includes the stories of the workers who were often invisible. At Biltmore, the rigid hierarchy of the staff meant that a mistake in service could result in immediate dismissal, and the lives of those living in the servants' quarters were a world away from the luxury of the guest suites. At Oheka, the sheer scale of the maintenance required meant that the staff was under constant pressure to maintain a level of perfection that was humanly impossible. These stories of struggle, both at the top and the bottom of the social ladder, provide a necessary counterpoint to the glittering image of the Gilded Age. They remind us that these houses were built by people with flaws, fears, and heartaches. The stone and concrete may be cold, but the history they contain is warm with the friction of human life. As we look at the survival of these two palaces, we must acknowledge that their endurance is a testament to the resilience of the families and individuals who were willing to endure the scandals and the tragedies to keep the dream alive. The legacy of Biltmore and Oheka is not just one of beauty, but of the persistence of the human spirit in the face of changing times and personal loss. The ghosts of the past, whether they are the quiet scholars of the Vanderbilt Library or the opera stars of the Kahn Ballroom, continue to haunt these halls, not as frightening specters, but as reminders of the complexity of the American dream. The visual language of power in America has often been written in the stones of Biltmore and the concrete of Oheka Castle, as both estates transitioned from private sanctuaries to the most recognizable symbols of opulence on the silver screen. In this 12th chapter of our saga, we look at how Hollywood and the broader pop culture machine have used these two locations to define the very concept of the American palace for a global audience. For Biltmore, the relationship with cinema began as a way to bolster its public profile, and has since evolved into a cornerstone of its modern identity. The estate's dramatic French Renaissance profile and its misty, mountain backdrop provide a sense of timelessness that is a gift to cinematographers. One of the most significant early uses of the house was in the 1950s, but its true cinematic golden age arrived later. Perhaps the most iconic use of Biltmore's interior was in the 1970s for the film Being There, where the vast, cold grandeur of the house served as a metaphor for the isolation of the upper class. The audience watched as Peter Sellers moved through the library and the gardens, and the house itself became a character, silent, imposing, and slightly otherworldly. Later, in the 1990s, Biltmore stood in for the ancestral home of the eccentric and wealthy in movies like Richie Rich and Hannibal. In Richie Rich, the house was transformed into the ultimate playground for the world's wealthiest child, a move that introduced the estate to a whole new generation of viewers who saw it as the literal definition of having it all. In contrast, when used for the darker, more psychological thriller Hannibal, the shadows of the Winter Garden and the Grand Staircase took on a sinister, Gothic quality, proving that the architecture of Richard Morris Hunt could evoke as much dread as it did wonder. This cinematic versatility is a testament to the layered design of the house, which can shift from a sunny, aristocratic dream to a brooding fortress with a simple change in lighting. While Biltmore was becoming the go-to location for established old-money grandeur, Oheka Castle was carving out a niche as the ultimate backdrop for the aspirational, high-energy glamour of the Jazz Age and modern celebrity culture. The story of Oheka on screen is inextricably linked to the legend of the Great Gatsby. While several versions of the film have been made, Oheka has frequently been cited by historians and directors alike as the primary physical inspiration for the fictional Gatsby estate. Its geometric gardens and sprawling terraces perfectly capture the colossal nature of the house described by F. Scott Fitzgerald. In the modern era, Oheka has become a favorite of the music video industry and television production. It served as the primary filming location for the show Royal Pains, where its role as a high-end medical retreat for the wealthy of the Hamptons mirrored its real-life history as a sanctuary for the elite. One of its most famous recent appearances was in Taylor Swift's Blank Space music video, which utilized the grand ballroom, the marble staircases, and the formal gardens to create a hyper-stylized vision of a mansion-dwelling socialite. This single video brought the image of Oheka to billions of screens worldwide, cementing its status as the premier icon of new money, luxury, and romantic drama. The difference in how these two houses are cast reflects their real-world origins. Biltmore is almost always cast as the ancestral home, a place of deep history, secret passages, and heavy, multi-generational weight. Oheka is cast as the party house, a place of spectacle, performance, and immediate, dazzling impact. This pop culture exposure has been a vital part of the economic survival of both estates. The fees paid by production companies are substantial, but the real value lies in the free marketing that comes from being featured in a blockbuster film or a hit music video. It keeps the properties relevant in the public imagination, ensuring that each new generation of travelers wants to see the Richie Rich house or the Gatsby garden in person. However, this fame comes with its own set of challenges. The logistical nightmare of bringing a film crew of hundreds into a historic site is immense. At Biltmore, the preservation team must oversee every aspect of a shoot, ensuring that heavy equipment doesn't damage the original floors and that the lighting rigs don't harm the delicate tapestries. There's a constant tension between the need for commercial revenue and the duty of historical preservation. At Oheka, the house has been modified over the years to be more camera-friendly, yet it must still maintain the integrity that makes it a historic landmark. The cinematic legacy also creates a certain level of expectation for visitors. People arrive at Biltmore expecting to feel like a Vanderbilt, or at Oheka expecting to hear the echoes of a 1920s gala. Both estates have leaned into this, offering special tours that highlight filming locations and the movie magic behind the scenes. This intersection of reality and fiction has turned the houses into something more than just buildings. They are cultural touchstones that represent the peak of the American dream. We see this also in how the houses are used for high-profile fashion photography and luxury brand advertisements. The limestone of Biltmore and the reflecting pools of Oheka have sold everything from haute couture to high-end automobiles, proving that the Gilded Age aesthetic still carries a weight of prestige that modern glass and steel architecture simply cannot match. As we look at the screens of our phones and televisions, we are constantly being fed the imagery of these two palaces, often without even realizing it. They have become the universal shorthand for wealth and status. The story of Biltmore and Oheka is no longer just a story of two families. It is a story that belongs to the collective consciousness of the world. By opening their doors to the cameras, the stewards of these estates have ensured that even if the physical stones were to crumble, the image of their grandeur would live on forever in the digital archives of history. This cinematic immortality is perhaps the most modern form of the legacy that George Vanderbilt and Otto Kahn were trying to build. They wanted to create something that would last, and through the lens of Hollywood, they have achieved a level of fame that far exceeds anything they could have imagined in their own lifetimes. As we move into the penultimate stages of our journey, we will see how this public fame balances against the private efforts to keep these massive structures standing in a world that is increasingly focused on the future rather than the past. The lights of the film sets may eventually dim, and the cameras may move on to the next location, but for Biltmore and Oheka, the role of the Grand American Palace is one they were born to play, and one they will likely hold as long as the public remains fascinated by the lives of the titans who built them. The concept of the Gilded Age was always rooted in the idea of the spectacular, but nowhere is the competitive grandeur of Biltmore and Oheka Castle more evident than in the way these two palaces transformed themselves for the winter holidays. This 13th chapter of our narrative explores the seasonal rituals that turned these massive stone structures into beacons of warmth and light, creating a legacy of holiday celebration that continues to draw hundreds of thousands of visitors to this day. At Biltmore, the tradition of Christmas is woven into the very fabric of the house's history, beginning with the legendary housewarming party George Vanderbilt hosted on Christmas Eve in 1895. For George, the holiday was the ultimate opportunity to showcase the estate as a center of community and hospitality. The centerpiece of the celebration then, as it is now, was the 7-story banquet hall. To fill such a cavernous space, the Vanderbilts would bring in a Fraser fir so large it required dozens of men, and a complex system of ropes and pulleys just to stand it upright. This was not a mere decoration. It was a psychological anchor for the entire estate, reminding guests that even in the middle of the rugged Blue Ridge Mountains, the family could command the wonders of the world. The early Vanderbilt Christmases were also a time of philanthropic duty. George and Edith would host a party for the children of the estate workers and the local Asheville community, distributing gifts and ensuring that the prosperity of Biltmore was felt by those who toiled in its shadows. Today, the Biltmore Company has turned this tradition into a month-long extravaganza that is a marvel of logistical planning. Beginning in early November, a team of floral designers and decorators descends upon the house, installing over 100 Christmas trees, miles of evergreen garlands, and thousands of points of light. The challenge of decorating a 250-room mansion is monumental. Every fireplace must be adorned with period-appropriate greenery, and the dining tables must be set with the family's finest china and crystal to recreate the atmosphere of 1895. The sensory experience is completed with live music echoing through the halls, from the massive pipe organ in the banquet hall to choirs singing in the winter garden. This seasonal pivot is the single most important period for Biltmore's financial health, proving that the public's desire for a Victorian-era fantasy is the engine that keeps the modern preservation efforts funded. Across the country on the Gold Coast of Long Island, Otto Kahn's Oheka Castle celebrated the holidays with the frenetic, sophisticated energy of the Jazz Age. If Biltmore was a Victorian Christmas carol, Oheka was a high-society winter gala. Kahn used the holidays to solidify his role as the premier host of New York society. The sunken gardens, often dusted with snow, provided a stark, geometric beauty that framed the castle's glowing windows. Inside, the massive ballrooms were filled with the sounds of world-class orchestras and the laughter of the era's most famous faces. Kahn's holiday parties were legendary for their excess and their attention to detail. He would often commission elaborate ice sculptures and have the finest delicacies shipped in from Europe. While Biltmore's tradition was focused on the family and the local land, Oheka's holiday spirit was focused on the performance of wealth and the celebration of modern achievement. The transition to the modern era for Oheka's holiday traditions was more complex due to the years of abandonment. When Gary Melius restored the estate, he had to invent a new holiday identity for the castle that honored its past while serving its new role as a luxury hotel and event space. Today, Oheka's holiday season is defined by its elegance, and its role as a premier destination for winter weddings and high-end corporate retreats. The grand staircase, often decorated with cascading ribbons and lights, has become one of the most photographed holiday locations in the world. The contrast in holiday styles between the two estates is a final reflection of their overall characters. Biltmore offers a sense of continuity, a warm, nostalgic embrace of the past that feels like stepping back into the 19th century. Oheka offers a more polished, contemporary glamour, a place where the holiday season feels like an invitation to join the inner circle of the elite. Both estates, however, share the same massive logistical burden during the winter months. Heating these structures remains a staggering expense, and protecting the historic interiors from the dry air and the increased foot traffic of the holiday crowds requires constant monitoring. At Biltmore, the preservation team uses the winter months to assess the impact of thousands of visitors on the original floors and carpets, often rotating artifacts to prevent overexposure. At Oheka, the hospitality staff must balance the demands of holiday guests with the need to keep the building in pristine condition. The holiday traditions also serve as a reminder of the workers who have always been the heartbeat of these estates. From the 19th century footmen who hauled wood for the 65 fireplaces at Biltmore to the modern-day event planners at Oheka who ensure every candle is lit, the holiday magic is a result of immense human effort. As we reach the end of the year, both palaces stand as monuments to the American belief that bigger is indeed better, and that the celebration of success should be as grand as the success itself. The lights reflected in the pools of Oheka and the glow of the fire in the Biltmore Library are symbols of a legacy that refuses to go dark. These holiday traditions have turned the houses into more than just architectural landmarks. They have become part of the collective memory of the nation, a shared dream of a golden, glittering past. As the snow falls on the Blue Ridge and the wind whips off the Long Island Sound, Biltmore and Oheka continue to serve as the ultimate stages for the American winter, proving that while the men who built them are long gone, their ability to inspire wonder remains undiminished. This seasonal transformation is the bridge between the private history of the Vanderbilt and Kahn families and the public future of their estates, ensuring that the story of the American palace is one that is told anew with every falling snowflake and every lit candle. We have traveled through the construction, the scandals, the cinema, and the seasons, and now we stand at the threshold of the final chapter of this epic comparison. In this final chapter of our exploration into the American Gilded Age, we find that the true legacy of Biltmore and Oheka Castle is not merely measured in tons of limestone or the square footage of their ballrooms, but in their status as survivors of a world that was never meant to last. As we stand in the twilight of this 14-part journey, we must ask what these two palaces tell us about the American character and our complicated relationship with the concept of royalty, wealth, and permanence. The fates of George Vanderbilt and Otto Kahn were written into the foundations of their homes, yet the endurance of those homes required a pivot that neither man could have fully envisioned. At Biltmore, the Vanderbilt family's success lies in their ability to transform a private burden into a public treasure without losing the soul of the original vision. By the dawn of the 21st century, Biltmore had become a blueprint for how to save a historic estate in a democratic society. It proved that history could be a sustainable industry, one that supports thousands of families and preserves tens of thousands of acres of forest. The family didn't just keep the house, they kept the land, the art, and the archives, creating a continuous thread of history that remains unbroken. When you walk through the doors of Biltmore today, you are seeing a version of the 19th century that has been polished by the professionalism of the 21st, a place where the Vanderbilt name is no longer just a symbol of a railroad empire, but a brand synonymous with American craftsmanship and conservation. Across the miles on Long Island, the legacy of Oheka Castle is one of resurrection and the power of individual obsession. If Biltmore is a story of continuity, Oheka is a story of redemption. Its survival is a miracle of the modern era, proving that even after a building has been stripped, burned, and abandoned to the forest, it can be brought back to life if someone is willing to see the beauty beneath the ruin. Otto Kahn's dream was nearly erased from the map, yet through the sheer willpower of Gary Melius, it rose again to reclaim its place as the crown jewel of the Gold Coast. Oheka reminds us that the American spirit is often defined by the second act, the ability to rebuild and reinvent. It serves as a warning of how easily our heritage can be lost, and a celebration of the effort required to save it. Today, Oheka stands not just as a luxury hotel, but as a monument to the idea that some things are too beautiful to let die. When we compare these two fates, we see a mirror of the American experience itself. Biltmore represents the conservative impulse to protect and pass down, while Oheka represents the entrepreneurial impulse to risk everything for a vision of grandeur. Both houses have had to navigate the transition from the era of the individual titan to the era of the collective public. They have survived the introduction of the income tax, the Great Depression, the shift toward suburbanization, and the digital revolution. They have moved from being private fortresses to being public stages, where we now go to project our own dreams of a more elegant time. The costs of this survival are immense. It takes a small army of masons, historians, gardeners, and business managers to keep the rod at bay and the lights on. It requires a constant dialogue with a public that is increasingly removed from the social hierarchies of 1900. Yet, the public's fascination with these houses only grows. We are drawn to them because they represent a level of ambition that feels almost mythical in our age of prefabricated structures and digital assets. We crave the weight of the stone, the texture of the hand-carved wood, and the sheer audacity of a house with 250 rooms. These palaces are our cathedrals, our secular temples to a time when men tried to build for eternity. As we look toward the future, the challenge for Biltmore and Oheka will be to remain relevant in a world that is moving faster than ever. They must continue to find ways to tell their stories to new generations who may not know the names Vanderbilt or Kahn, but who still recognize the feeling of awe that these buildings inspire. The survival of these estates tells us that history in America is not a static thing. It is a living, breathing project that requires constant reinvestment. We have seen how the architectural choices of the 1890s and the 1920s continue to influence the economics of 2026. We have seen how the movies we watch and the music we hear are shaped by these locations. Most importantly, we have seen that the true measure of a Gilded Age palace is its ability to adapt. George Vanderbilt's forest and Otto Kahn's gardens are still here, not because the men were immortal, but because the structures they built were capable of holding the imaginations of those who came after them. The story of Biltmore versus Oheka is not a competition with a winner and a loser. It is a dual chronicle of the American dream in its most physical and extravagant form. One followed the path of the steward, the other the path of the phoenix. Both remind us that while wealth is fleeting, the beauty we create with it can endure, provided we have the courage to protect it. As the sun sets over the Blue Ridge and the lights of the Gold Coast begin to twinkle, these two palaces remain as they always were, beacons of human ambition, standing tall against the passage of time. They are the anchors of our past and the reminders of what is possible when we dream in stone and concrete. The Gilded Age may be a century behind us, but its echoes are still loud in the halls of Biltmore and the terraces of Oheka, calling us to remember a time when the world was vast, the possibilities were endless, and a house was not just a home, but a monument to the very idea of America. This concludes our journey through the two greatest palaces of the American age, a story of scale, ownership, and the incredible will to survive.